Welcome back to HOA Spot. I thought it would be a warning. It was a campaign. You are going to respect my authority. That was the first thing Helen Phillips screamed at me while I stood in my own driveway holding a post cap I had just picked up off the ground. She was jabbing her finger at the fence panel leaning against my house, the one that had been there for maybe 10 minutes, and she was holding a folded map in her other hand like it was a court order. She shouted that I was trespassing on community property and she would prove it with her own map. I am a restaurant kitchen manager in Boston, Massachusetts, and I run on tight timing and prep windows, so when someone tells me I am trespassing in my own driveway, I check the clock and I check the facts. It was 6:45 on a Tuesday evening in April, and I had a gate technician coming at 7 to fix the backyard latch, which was my only access path for service, and Helen was blocking my driveway with her car and her fury. The fence panel had arrived at 6:30, dropped off by the contractor who was supposed to return the next morning to install it, and Helen had apparently been watching from her car 2 houses down because she was on me before I even brought the panel around back. Helen Phillips was the vendor coordinator for Falcon Point Landing Association, which meant she was the person who threatened contractors and service techs if they did not follow her version of the rules. She had been on the board for 3 years, and her thing was surprise inspections and photo stalking the moment a contractor truck pulled up. She wore a white light jacket with the hood up, even though it was 60 degrees, and she had a glove box envelope of certified slips with dirt-smudged corners tucked under her arm, the kind you get when you send a lot of registered mail. She also had a gray sun hat crammed on top of the hood, which looked ridiculous but somehow made her more intimidating. I said, "Helen, this panel has been here for 10 minutes. The contractor is coming back tomorrow, and I have a service call in 15 minutes, so I need you to move your car." She said, "I decide what counts as compliant, not you, and outdoor storage is outdoor storage," and she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the panel, the post cap in my hand, and my face. I said, "You are in my driveway," and she said, "This driveway easement is shared property per the recorded plat, and you are in violation of Section 9.3, temporary outdoor storage of construction materials." I had lived in Falcon Point Landing for 2 years, and I knew Helen was the type to escalate, but I did not know how fast she could move until that night. I was trying to refinance my place to lock in a better rate, and any lien threat could wreck the deal, so I needed this to stay small. I said, "Helen, I will move the panel to the backyard right now. Just let me get the gate open." She said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." And she pointed at my doorbell camera like it was a prop, in her case, against me. I said, "I am not arguing with you. I am telling you what is happening." And she said, "You are going to get a notice tomorrow. And if that panel is still visible from the street at any point, you are going to get a fine on top of it." The gate technician pulled up at 6:58 in a white work van with a tool bag slung over his shoulder, and Helen immediately turned her attention to him. She said, "Are you here for this property?" And he said, "Yeah, I am here to fix a latch." And she said, "You need to park on the street, not in the driveway, because this is a shared easement and you are blocking access." The technician looked at me, looked at her, and said, "Lady, I am going to be here for 20 minutes. And she said, "I am documenting this as a contractor violation." And she took more pictures. The technician said, "I do not work for you, I work for him." And he walked past her to the backyard gate. Helen followed him. She stood at the edge of my driveway with her phone out, filming him as he opened his tool bag and started working on the latch. I said, "Helen, you need to leave," and she said, "I am on the easement, which is common property, and I have every right to document violations." The technician said, "You are going to be in my shot if you keep standing there." And she said, "Your presence here is the violation." And he said, "I am going to finish this job and leave, and if you want to complain, you can call my boss." The technician finished in 18 minutes and told me the latch was good to go. He also said, "That lady is going to be a problem for you," and I said, "I know," and he said, "Document everything, because people like that do not stop." He left, and Helen was still standing in the driveway when I went back out to move the fence panel. She said, "It is too late. I already have the photos, and I already sent them to the management company." I said, "Helen, the panel is going in the backyard right now," and she said, "The violation occurred when it was visible from the street, and the timeline does not matter." I moved the panel to the backyard and leaned it against the back fence where no one from the street could see it. I went inside and opened my email, and there was already a message from the management company with a timestamp of 7:14, which was 16 minutes after I had gotten home. The email said I was in violation of outdoor storage rules, and I had 72 hours to remove the materials or face a $50 fine, and it referenced photos attached. I opened the photos, and they showed the panel against my house, the post cap on the ground, and the contractor truck in the driveway. The metadata on the photos said they were taken at 6:43, which was before I had even brought the panel around from the front. I replied to the management company and said the materials were removed within 30 minutes of delivery, and I attached a still frame from my doorbell camera showing the timestamp of 6:59 when I carried the panel to the backyard. I also said that the photos Helen submitted were taken before I had even unloaded the panel, and I requested clarification on what the actual violation was. The management company replied the next morning and said the violation stood because the materials were visible from the street at the time of the complaint, and the 72-hour deadline remained in effect. I called the management company and asked to speak to someone above the compliance coordinator, and I got transferred to a man named Richard who said he was the regional manager. I said, "Richard, the materials were moved within 30 minutes, and the photos Helen sent were taken before the materials were even placed. So what is the actual violation?" Richard said, "The violation is outdoor storage, and the timeline is based on when the complaint was filed, not when the materials were removed." I said, "So if someone files a complaint before something happens, it still counts." Richard said, "The complaint was filed when the materials were visible, and he did not want to litigate timelines." I said, "Richard, I am going to send you the full timeline with camera stills and metadata, and I want a response in writing." He said, "You can send whatever you want, but the fine is going to be assessed if the materials are not removed by the deadline." I said, "The materials are already removed," and he said, "Then you have nothing to worry about." I hung up and started building a file. I pulled the doorbell camera footage from 6:30 to 7:30. I pulled the email timestamps. I pulled the photo metadata from Helen's submission. And I saved everything in a folder labeled Fence Panel April. The next morning, the contractor came back at 8 to install the panel, and Helen was in her car at the end of the block before he even unloaded his truck. He backed into my driveway, opened the rear door, and pulled out the panel, 2 posts, a bag of concrete mix, and a post hole digger. Helen was out of her car and walking toward us before he set the first post down. She said, "You are not authorized to do this work." And the contractor said, "I have a signed contract with the homeowner," and she said, "The HOA has not approved this installation, and you need to stop immediately." The contractor looked at me and said, "Do you have an approval letter?" And I said, "I submitted the request 3 weeks ago, and I have not gotten a response." And Helen said, That means it is denied by default, and you are in violation if you proceed. The contractor said, "Lady, I have done work in this neighborhood before, and you do not have the authority to stop me unless you have a court order." Helen said, "I have the authority to issue a stop work notice, and I have the authority to fine this property for non-compliance, and if you proceed, I will make sure your company never works in Falcon Point Landing again." The contractor said, "Are you threatening me?" And Helen said, "I am informing you of the consequences." And he said, "I am going to call my boss and see what he wants to do." He stepped away and made the call, and I could hear him explaining the situation. He came back and said, "My boss says we are not going to risk it, and we are going to leave, and you need to call us when you have the approval sorted out." He loaded the materials back into the truck and left, and Helen stood in my driveway with her arms crossed and said, "You should have followed the process." I said, "Helen, I submitted the request 3 weeks ago and I have not gotten a response, so what is the process?" She said, "The process is that you wait for approval, and if you do not get approval, you do not do the work." I said, "How long does approval take?" And she said, "As long as it takes." And I said, "That is not a process. That is stalling." Helen said, "If you have a problem with the process, you can appeal at the next board meeting, which is in 6 weeks. I said 6 weeks, and she said that is the schedule, and she walked back to her car and left. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit that like button and subscribe, because it only gets wilder from here. I went inside and pulled the HOA covenants and the architectural review process from the association website. The covenant said that requests must be responded to within 30 days, and it had been 21 days since I submitted mine, which meant I still had 9 days before they were in violation. I also found a section that said if the board did not respond within 30 days, the request was automatically approved unless the board provided written notice of denial with a reason. I printed the relevant pages and highlighted the sections, and I sent an email to the management company with a PDF attachment and a note that said I expected a response within the remaining 9 days or I would proceed under the automatic approval clause. Richard replied 2 hours later and said the 30-day rule applied to responses, not approvals, and the board could take as long as they needed to review the request. I replied and said the covenant language said response, not approval, and a response meant yes or no with a reason, and silence was not a response. Richard said he would forward my email to the board and I should expect a response at the next meeting. I said, the next meeting is in 6 weeks, which is outside the 30-day window, and Richard stopped replying. I called a retired police officer named Tom, who lived 2 streets over in Falcon Point Landing, and who I had met at a neighborhood cookout the previous summer. Tom had dealt with HOA issues before, and he had told me that most HOA disputes came down to whether the board followed their own rules. I explained the situation, and Tom said, "You need to document every communication, you need to know the covenants better than they do, and you need to be ready to show up at a meeting with proof." He also said, "If they are stalling, it is because they do not have a legal reason to deny you, and they are hoping you will give up or make a mistake they can use against you." Tom said he would come with me to the next board meeting if it got that far, and he also said I should request a copy of the board meeting minutes from the past 6 months to see if anyone else had been approved or denied for similar work. I sent a formal records request to the management company that afternoon and asked for copies of all architectural review decisions from the past year, plus copies of the board meeting minutes from the past 6 months. Richard replied and said records requests cost 25 cents per page and I needed to prepay, and I said fine, send me an invoice. The invoice came 2 days later and said 87 pages at 25 cents per page, totaled $21.75. I paid with a credit card and waited. The records arrived 5 days later in a large envelope with a management company return address, and I spread them out on my kitchen table and started reading. The architectural review decisions from the past year showed that 12 requests had been submitted, and 10 had been approved, 1 had been denied, and 1 was listed as pending. The pending one was mine. The denied request was from a homeowner who wanted to install a 6-foot privacy fence, and the denial reason was that the maximum height allowed was 4 feet per the covenants. I checked my own request, and I had specified a 4-foot fence, so height was not an issue. I kept reading and found that 3 of the approved requests were for fences, and all 3 had been approved within 2 weeks of submission. I noted the dates and the names, and I saw that one of the approved requests was for a homeowner on the same street as Helen, and the approval had been granted in 9 days. The meeting minutes were more interesting. The minutes from March showed that Helen had proposed a new rule requiring all contractor vehicles to park on the street instead of in driveways during work hours, and the rule had been voted down by the rest of the board. The minutes from February showed that Helen had filed 3 complaints against homeowners for outdoor storage violations, and 2 of the complaints had been dismissed because the storage was temporary, and the materials were removed within 24 hours. The minutes from January showed that Helen had been absent from the meeting due to a scheduling conflict, and in her absence, the board had approved 2 fence requests without any discussion. I started to see a pattern. When Helen was at the meetings, requests got delayed or denied. When she was not at the meetings, requests got approved quickly. I also noticed that the minutes included a section called Compliance Actions, and in that section, Helen was listed as the person who filed every single outdoor storage complaint in the past 6 months. No one else on the board had filed any complaints. I printed the minutes and highlighted the relevant sections, and I added them to my Fence Panel April folder. The next morning, I got a certified letter in the mail from the management company. The envelope had dirt-smudged corners and a return address printed in small letters. Inside was a notice that said I was in violation of the 72-hour deadline for removing outdoor storage materials, and I was being assessed a $50 fine plus a $25 administrative fee. The notice also said that if I did not pay within 10 days, the fine would increase to $100, and the association could place a lien on my property. I read the notice 3 times, and then I pulled the timeline I had built. The materials had been delivered at 6:30, moved to the backyard at 6:59, and removed from visibility by 7:05. The notice said the violation occurred at 6:45, which was when Helen took her photos, but the materials were moved within 34 minutes of that timestamp. The 72-hour deadline made no sense because the materials were never there for 72 hours. I called Richard and said, "Richard, this fine is based on a false timeline, and I have proof." Richard said, "The fine is based on the complaint that was filed, and the deadline is standard procedure." I said, "Richard, I am not paying this fine, and I am filing an appeal," and Richard said, "You can appeal at the next board meeting." I said, "The next board meeting is in 5 weeks, and this notice says I have 10 days to pay, so how am I supposed to appeal before the fine increases?" Richard said, "You can pay the fine and request a refund if the appeal is successful." I said, "I am not paying a fine for something I did not do," and Richard said, "Then the fine will increase and we will proceed with a lien." I said, "You are not placing a lien on my property over a fence panel that was visible for 30 minutes, and Richard said, "We will see," and he hung up. I called Tom and told him about the fine, and Tom said, "Do not pay it. and do not let them intimidate you. He said if they try to file a lien, you can challenge it in court, and they know that, so they are betting you will pay to make it go away. Tom also said, you need to go to the next board meeting and bring everything you have, and you need to make them answer for the selective enforcement. I said, what if they do not let me speak? And Tom said they have to let you speak if you are a homeowner, and if they try to shut you down, you walk out and you file a complaint with the state. I spent the next 2 weeks building my case. I organized the timeline, the emails, the doorbell camera footage, the records request results, and the meeting minutes into a binder with tabs. I also found the Massachusetts statutes on HOA enforcement and printed the sections that said associations had to follow their own rules and could not enforce rules selectively. I highlighted the part that said homeowners had the right to appeal fines and the right to request a hearing before a lien could be filed. I made copies of everything and put them in a second binder in case I needed to leave one with the board. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night at 7 in the community clubhouse, and I got there at 6:50 with Tom. The clubhouse was a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood with a meeting room, a kitchenette, and a bathroom. There were 6 chairs set up in a row facing a folding table where the board members sat, and there were already 3 other homeowners in the chairs when we walked in. Helen was at the table with 4 other board members, and she looked at me when I walked in and then looked down at a stack of papers in front of her. The board president was a man in his 60s named Ed who opened the meeting at 7:03 and said they had a full agenda and they needed to keep comments brief. He went through the standard business, budget updates, a landscaping contract renewal, and a discussion about pool hours for the summer. Then he said, we have one appeal on the agenda tonight from a homeowner regarding an outdoor storage fine. I stood up and said, that is me, and Ed said, you will have 5 minutes to present your case, and then the board will vote. I walked to the front and opened my binder and said, my name is on record, I live on Oakmont Drive, and I am appealing a $50 fine plus a $25 administrative fee for an outdoor storage violation that did not happen. I pulled out the timeline and handed copies to each board member. I said on April 15th, a fence panel was delivered to my property at 6:30 in the evening. At 6:43, Helen Phillips took photos of the panel and filed a complaint with the management company. At 6:59, I moved the panel to my backyard where it was not visible from the street. At 7:14, I received an email from the management company saying I had 72 hours to remove the materials. The materials were removed within 34 minutes of the complaint, so there was no violation. Helen said, the violation occurred when the materials were visible, and the timeline does not matter. I said, the timeline is the only thing that matters, because your own covenants say outdoor storage means materials left in place for more than 24 hours, and I removed the materials in 34 minutes. Helen said, that is not what the rule says, and I said, I have the covenants right here, section 9.3, and I read it out loud. Ed said, let me see that, and I handed him the covenant pages. He read them and said, it does say 24 hours. Helen said, the complaint was filed when the materials were visible, and the fine is based on the complaint, not the removal. I said, if that is the standard, then anyone can file a complaint at any time and trigger a fine, even if the materials are removed immediately. Helen said, the rules are the rules, and I said, the rules say 24 hours, and I met that standard. Ed said, we will take this under advisement and vote, and I said, I am not done. Ed said, your 5 minutes are up, and I said, I have evidence of selective enforcement, and I would like to present it. Ed looked at the other board members, and one of them, a woman named Carol, said, Let him finish. Ed said, "You have 2 more minutes." I pulled out the records request results and said, "I requested copies of all architectural review decisions from the past year and all meeting minutes from the past 6 months." I found that Helen has filed every single outdoor storage complaint in the past 6 months, and all of them were dismissed except mine. I also found that when Helen is not at meetings, fence requests get approved in 2 weeks, and when she is at meetings, they get delayed or denied. I also found that my fence request has been pending for 5 weeks, which is past the 30-day response deadline in the covenants, which means it should be automatically approved. Helen stood up and said, "That is not how it works," and I said, "It is exactly how it works," and I read the covenant section out loud. Ed said, "We need to verify that language," and I said, "I have it right here," and I handed him another page. Carol said, "If that is accurate, then we need to approve his request tonight." Helen said, "We do not have enough information to approve it," and Carol said, "He submitted the request 5 weeks ago. How much more time do you need?" Tom stood up from his chair and said, "I am Tom Brennan. I live on Carlisle Court, and I am a retired police officer. I have reviewed this homeowner's documentation, and I can tell you that if this fine stands, he has grounds to file a complaint with the State Attorney General for selective enforcement and violation of the association's own covenants. He also has grounds to sue for damages if a lien is placed on his property based on a false violation. I would recommend the board dismiss the fine tonight and approve his fence request tonight, or you are going to have a bigger problem." Ed said, "We will take a 5-minute recess to discuss this," and the board members stood up and walked into the kitchenette. Helen stayed at the table and glared at me, and I glared back. She said, "You think you are clever," and I said, "I think I can read." She said, "This is not over," and I said, "It is if the board has any sense." Tom leaned over and said, "You did good. Now let them sweat." The board came back after 7 minutes, and Ed said, "We have reviewed the documentation, and we are going to dismiss the fine and approve the fence request with the condition that the fence meets the height and setback requirements in the covenants." I said, "It does. I have the measurements in my original request." Ed said, "Then you are approved, and you can proceed with installation." Helen said, "I would like to note my objection for the record," and Ed said, "Noted," and he moved on to the next agenda item. I sat down, and Tom patted me on the shoulder and said, "That is how you do it." I stayed for the rest of the meeting to see if Helen would say anything else, but she did not. When the meeting ended, I walked out with Tom, and Helen was standing by her car in the parking lot. She said, "You got lucky tonight, but I am going to be watching your property, and if you make one mistake, I will file another complaint." I said, "Helen, I have cameras on every side of my house, and I keep every email and every photo, so if you want to keep trying, go ahead." She got in her car and left, and Tom said, "She is not going to stop, so you need to stay ready." The contractor came back 2 days later and installed the fence panel in less than 3 hours. He dug the post holes, set the posts in concrete, and attached the panel between them. He also brought a level and a tape measure and double-checked the height and setback to make sure everything was compliant. Helen drove by twice during the installation, and both times she slowed down and took photos from her car. The contractor said, "That lady is unhinged," and I said, "I know," and he said, "If she files another complaint, call me and I will come to the meeting and explain what we did." 3 days after the installation, I got another certified letter from the management company. This time the envelope had a return address I did not recognize, and inside was a notice from Helen personally, not from the management company. The notice said I was in violation of a new rule regarding contractor parking, and I was being fined $50 for allowing a contractor vehicle to park in my driveway during work hours. The notice also said the new rule had been passed at the April board meeting and was effective immediately. I pulled the meeting minutes from April and read them twice. There was no mention of a contractor parking rule being passed. The minutes showed that Helen had proposed the rule in March and it had been voted down. I emailed Richard and asked for clarification on when the contractor parking rule had been passed, and Richard replied and said there was no contractor parking rule in effect. I forwarded Richard's email to Helen and said, "You are issuing fines based on rules that do not exist, and this is harassment." Helen replied and said, "The rule is in the minutes, and if you did not read them, that is your problem." I replied and said, "I have the minutes, and the rule was voted down in March," and Richard confirmed there is no contractor parking rule in effect. Helen did not reply. I forwarded the entire email chain to Ed and Carol and said, "Helen is issuing fines based on rules that do not exist, and I am requesting that the board take action to stop this harassment." Ed called me the next day and said, "We are aware of the issue, and we are going to address it at the next board meeting." I said, "Ed, the next board meeting is in 4 weeks, and Helen is sending me fake fines right now." Ed said, "I understand your frustration, but we have to follow the process." I said, "The process is broken if one board member can issue fake fines and the rest of the board does nothing for 4 weeks." Ed said, "I will talk to Helen and tell her to stop," and I said, "Talking is not enough, you need to take action." I hung up and called Tom, and Tom said, "You need to file a complaint with the management company and demand that they investigate Helen for harassment and selective enforcement." He also said, "If the board does not take action, you need to file a complaint with the Massachusetts Attorney General, because HOAs are required to follow their own rules and they cannot allow board members to harass homeowners." I said, "How do I file a complaint with the Attorney General?" And Tom said, "I will help you, but let us give the board one more chance." I sent a formal complaint to the management company the next day. The complaint listed every interaction I had with Helen, every fake fine, every selective enforcement action, and every email where she either lied or issued threats. I attached copies of the timeline, the emails, the meeting minutes, the records request results, and the doorbell camera footage. I also attached Richard's email confirming that the contractor parking rule did not exist. I requested that the management company investigate Helen for harassment and selective enforcement and take disciplinary action. Richard replied 2 days later and said the complaint had been forwarded to the board and the management company would conduct an internal review. He also said the review would take 30 days and I would receive a written response. I said, 30 days is too long, Helen is still sending me fake fines, and Richard said, we cannot take action until the review is complete. Tom said, that is when you file the complaint with the Attorney General, and I said, how long does that take? And Tom said, it can take months. But the important thing is that once you file, the HOA knows they are under scrutiny and they usually back off. Tom also said, you should also file a small claims case for the fake fines and the time you have spent dealing with this, because the HOA is responsible for Helen's actions even if they say they are not. I filed a complaint with the Massachusetts Attorney General the next week. The complaint form asked for a description of the issue, copies of relevant documents, and a statement of what I wanted the Attorney General to do. I wrote that Falcon Point Landing Association was allowing a board member to harass homeowners with fake fines and selective enforcement, and I wanted the Attorney General to investigate and force the association to adopt a clear compliance process with neutral appeal standards and proof requirements. I attached the same evidence I had sent to the management company, and I mailed the complaint certified mail. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Ed. He said, "We received a notice from the Attorney General that you filed a complaint, and the board is taking this very seriously." I said, "Good, because I have been dealing with Helen's harassment for 2 months and nothing has changed." Ed said, "We are going to hold a special meeting next week to discuss Helen's actions and determine whether she violated her duties as a board member." He also said, "You are invited to attend and present your evidence." The special meeting was held on a Tuesday night at 7 in the same clubhouse. This time there were 10 other homeowners in the chairs, and Tom was sitting in the front row. The board members were all there except Helen, who had sent an email saying she could not attend due to a family emergency. Ed opened the meeting and said, "We are here to review a complaint filed by a homeowner regarding actions taken by Helen Phillips in her role as vendor coordinator." He said, "We have reviewed the evidence submitted by the homeowner, and we have also reviewed emails and records from the management company." Ed said, "Based on our review, we have determined that Helen issued at least 3 fines that were not supported by the covenants, including a fine for outdoor storage that did not meet the 24-hour threshold, a fine for contractor parking based on a rule that was never passed, and a fine for a fence panel that was removed within the required time frame." He said, "We have also determined that Helen filed complaints selectively and that she delayed architectural review requests without a valid reason." Carol stood up and said, "I want to add that we found evidence that Helen moved a notice onto this homeowner's door to frame him as late, and she pretended she was shocked when he showed proof that the notice was delivered after the deadline." Carol said, "That is fraud, and it is unacceptable." Ed said, "The board has voted to remove Helen from her role as vendor coordinator, and we are going to appoint a new member to that position." He also said, "We are going to adopt a new compliance policy that requires all fines to be reviewed by the full board before they are issued, and we are going to require that all architectural review requests be responded to within 30 days. I stood up and said, "What about the fake fines I was issued?" And Ed said, "We are going to refund all fines that were issued in error, and we are going to send you a formal apology letter." I said, "What about the harassment?" And Ed said, "Helen is no longer in a position to issue fines or file complaints, and if she continues to harass you, we will remove her from the board entirely." I said, "I want that in writing," and Ed said, "You will receive a letter within the week." Tom leaned over and whispered, "You won," and I said, "It is not over until I get the refund and the letter." Tom said, "It is over, Helen is done, and the board knows they screwed up." 2 days later, I received a check for $150, which covered the 2 fake fines I had been issued, plus the administrative fees. I also received a letter from the board that said they apologized for the actions of Helen Phillips, and they were committed to ensuring that all compliance actions followed the covenants and were applied fairly. The letter also said that the board had adopted a new compliance policy that required all fines to be reviewed by the full board before they were issued, and all architectural review requests would be responded to within 30 days, or they would be automatically approved. The letter said the board had also hired an independent auditor to review the past 2 years of compliance actions and identify any other cases where fines were issued in error, and those homeowners would receive refunds. Helen resigned from the board 3 weeks later. Ed sent an email to all homeowners saying that Helen had decided to step down due to personal reasons, and the board thanked her for her service. The email did not mention the complaint or the special meeting. Tom said, "That is how they always do it. They let the person resign so they do not have to admit they screwed up. I said, I do not care how they do it as long as she is gone. The Attorney General sent me a letter a month later saying they had reviewed my complaint and they had contacted Falcon Point Landing Association to ensure that the issues I raised were addressed. The letter said the association had provided documentation showing they had adopted new policies and procedures, and the Attorney General considered the matter resolved. The letter also said that if I experienced further issues, I could file a new complaint. I never heard from Helen again. I saw her car drive past my house a few times, but she never stopped, and she never sent any more emails. The new vendor coordinator was a man named Steve, who sent a friendly email introducing himself and asking if I had any concerns about compliance. I replied and said I appreciated the outreach and I hoped the new process would work better. Steve said he had reviewed my file and he was sorry for what I had been through, and if I ever had issues in the future, I should contact him directly. The fence project was finished a week after the special meeting. The contractor installed the remaining panels, painted the posts, and added caps to match the ones I already had. The fence looked great, and it met every requirement in the covenants. I took photos of the finished fence and sent them to the board as documentation, and Ed replied and said it looked good and there were no issues. The refinance went through without any problems. The title company did a lien search and found nothing, and the bank approved the loan at the rate I wanted. I closed on the refinance in June, and I saved $300 a month on my mortgage payment, which more than covered the cost of the fence and the time I spent fighting Helen. Tom stopped by one afternoon with a six-pack of beer and said, "You handled that like a pro," and I said, "I could not have done it without your help." Tom said, "The key is knowing the rules and not backing down, and you did both." He also said, "Helen was a bully, and bullies always fold when someone stands up to them." I said she folded because the board finally did their job, and Tom said, "They did their job because you forced them to." I asked Tom if he thought the new compliance policy would actually work, and Tom said it will work as long as people hold the board accountable, and that means showing up to meetings and asking questions. He said, "The problem with most HOAs is that people do not pay attention until something happens to them, and by then it is too late." I said, "I am going to keep paying attention," and Tom said, "Good, because they need people like you." A few weeks later, I ran into Carol at the grocery store, and she said, "I want you to know that the audit turned up 6 other cases where Helen issued fines that were not valid, and we are refunding all of them." She said, "We also found that Helen had delayed 8 architectural review requests over the past 2 years, and we are approving all of them retroactively." Carol said, "I am embarrassed that this happened, and I am sorry we did not catch it sooner." I said, "I appreciate you saying that, and I hope the new process works." Carol said, "It will, because we are not going to let one person run the show anymore." She also said, "The board voted to require all compliance actions to be documented in the meeting minutes, and we are going to publish the minutes on the website so everyone can see what we are doing." I said, "That is a good change," and Carol said, "It should have been done years ago." The funny thing was, a few months later I found out that Helen had quoted the wrong minutes during one of her complaints, and the actual minutes contradicted her. She had claimed that a contractor parking rule had been passed in April, but the minutes showed that the rule had been voted down in March and never brought up again. When the auditor reviewed the records, they found that Helen had been using a draft version of the April minutes that included language she had written herself, and the draft had never been approved by the board. The auditor flagged it as a serious violation of board procedures, and it became part of the reason the board removed her. In the end, the HOA compliance process got audited and cleaned up, Helen's own selective enforcement got documented in the minutes, and I used a complaint to the management company that triggered discipline. The board adopted a clear fence policy with a neutral appeal process and proof standards, and the association paid my legal fees and the cost of the records requests. Helen lost her position, her credibility, and her ability to harass homeowners, and I got my fence, my refinance, and my peace of mind. I let her call my bluff because she did not realize I was not bluffing. I had a time-stamped timeline packet that made her story mathematically impossible, and I used it to trigger an internal audit, and the board panicked in real time. She had said her minutes were the truth, but the minutes proved she was lying, and that was the funniest part of all. She thought she could intimidate me with fake fines and selective enforcement, but all she did was give me a paper trail that destroyed her credibility and forced the board to act. Tom told me later that Helen had tried to file a complaint against me with the management company after she resigned, claiming I had harassed her during the special meeting. The management company reviewed the claim and dismissed it because there was no evidence, and because Helen was no longer a board member, she had no standing to file complaints. Tom said, "She is done, and she knows it," and I said, "Good, because I am done with her too." The neighborhood settled down after that. The new vendor coordinator sent out a quarterly email with reminders about common violations, but the tone was friendly, and the emails included clear instructions on how to request approval for projects. The board started holding open forums every other month where homeowners could ask questions and raise concerns, and attendance went up because people felt like they were being heard. I went to a few of the forums, and I noticed that other homeowners were asking about compliance procedures and quoting the covenants, which meant they were paying attention. I also noticed that the board started responding to architectural review requests within 2 weeks instead of waiting until the last day of the 30-day window. Steve, the new vendor coordinator, told me that the board had adopted an internal goal of responding within 14 days, and they were tracking response times to make sure they stayed on target. I said, "That is a big improvement," and Steve said, "We learned from what happened with you, and we are not going to let it happen again." A year later, I got a call from a homeowner 3 streets over who said she was dealing with a compliance issue and she had heard I had fought the HOA and won. She asked if I could help her understand the process, and I said, "Sure, come over, and I will show you what I did." She came over that afternoon with a stack of papers, and I walked her through the timeline method, the records request process, and the importance of knowing the covenants better than the board. She thanked me and said, "I did not know I had rights," and I said, "Everyone has rights, but you have to fight for them." She won her case 2 months later, and she sent me a thank you card with a gift certificate to a local restaurant. She said, "You gave me the tools to stand up for myself, and I am grateful." I said, "You did the work, I just showed you the map." She said the board tried to stall, but I used the automatic approval clause you told me about, and they backed down. I said that is how it works when you know the rules. Tom retired from his neighborhood watch role a few months after that, and he told me he was moving to Florida to be closer to his kids. He said, "You are going to be fine here. You know how to handle the HOA, and you have the respect of the board." I said, "I owe you a lot, Tom," and he said, "You do not owe me anything. You did all the heavy lifting." He also said, "If you ever need advice, call me," and I said, "I will, and I appreciate everything you did." The last time I saw Helen was at a community event in the fall. She was standing near the food table, and she saw me across the room and turned away. I did not go over to talk to her, and she did not come over to talk to me. Tom had told me that Helen had sold her house and was moving out of Falcon Point Landing, and I saw the for sale sign go up a few weeks later. The house sold in 3 weeks, and Helen was gone by the end of October. I kept the binder with all my evidence in a filing cabinet in my office just in case I ever needed it again. I also kept copies of the new compliance policy, the board meeting minutes, and the Attorney General correspondence. Tom had told me to treat the binder like insurance, and he was right. I never needed it again, but knowing it was there gave me confidence that if the board ever tried to pull something, I had the proof to fight back. The fence is still standing, and it looks as good as the day it was installed. I see it every morning when I let the dog out, and it reminds me that standing up for yourself is worth the effort. Helen tried to bully me into backing down, but I kept records, I knew the rules, and I did not give up. In the end, she lost everything she had built on fear and selective enforcement, and the neighborhood is better off without her. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.